So the next topic after the scientific method was evolution. Okay, so we talked about how species evolve or change over time. This is Charles Darwin, father of evolution. Traveled on the Beagle. We watched that video all about him. So natural selection is the theory that species over time will change because individuals with variations that are helpful are more likely to survive and reproduce than others. Darwin said that in all species, more organisms are born or produced than could ever survive. Right? If every single fish egg that is laid and fertilized hatched, our rivers would be just stuffed with fish. But they're not. Not all of them survive. Which ones do? The ones that happen to be born with helpful variations, useful variations. Because there's this competition, because there's a limited amount of resources, there's predators, there's all these factors that are affecting the population. The variations that are most helpful, they are going to be the ones that survive better and therefore pass their genes on to the next generation. Okay. So we talked about lots of examples of natural selection. The finches from the Galapagos Islands, the peppered moths, bacteria, and antibiotics. We talked about many different examples of this. And so over time, what this leads to is species changing, right? That's what evolution is. Species over a long period of time can go through changes, okay? Species can split from one species into multiple species, okay? And species that are not well adapted don't survive. They can become extinct. So the question is, why are the individuals different from each other? Why are we all different from each other? Why are squirrels all different from each other or oak trees? Well, there's really two big reasons why there's variation. One is mutations, right? That when DNA is being copied, there's sometimes just changes, random changes. And that could affect the organism, its traits. The other is sexual reproduction. Sexual reproduction mixes up the traits, the genes from both parent organisms and results in new combinations of characteristics. Crossing over can happen, okay? Shuffling the deck of the traits. So that's where the variation comes from. And some of these variations are helpful. Some are harmful. Some don't affect them either way. So we could see some examples of this. Here we have lots of variations in different species of fish. They're not identical. Here we have variation in some ladybugs, okay? Different numbers of spots, things like that. And sometimes a variation has adaptive value. We know that species have evolved over time because we have fossils, right? Fossils show us that 30 million years ago, horses were very different than they are today. Okay, here's our modern horse. And all these other species didn't survive. They became extinct. Modern horses are the only one that made it to the modern times. We can understand this using these branching tree diagrams. Here's another one for all of these finches. So, like that question you guys just answered, the more recently two species had a common ancestor, the more similar they're going to be. An example of how we see natural selection in action is antibiotics, right? And bacteria evolving to be resistant. Because when you take an antibiotic, it kills off first the weakest, the ones that don't have good resistance. The ones that do happen to have a variation that helps them survive better, they can survive longer. And if we don't kill all of them, they could start to repopulate and grow and reproduce passing on this resistance to the other species. We can tell if species are closely related by looking at different factors. That's what we just did in the lab you guys are doing, right? We looked at the shape of the leaves of Botanicurus and species X, Y, and Z. You looked at the seeds. You looked at the stems. We looked at the DNA, the proteins, the chromatography. And all of those things are giving us clues as to how these different species were related. Are they similar to each other? We also can see evidence in animals in looking at the structures that they have. The bone structure, for example, can help tell us that all of these species you see on the screen are related to each other. Right? They have similar bone structure, similar numbers of bones in the similar places. Now, there's some variation, but there's a lot of similarities, which tells us these things all had a common ancestor probably at some point in the past, which makes sense. They're all mammals. The best information we can use, the most clear, is molecular data. Right? When you looked at the leaves of those plants last week, like, yeah, the flowers, they look kind of similar in a lot of ways. It's kind of hard to distinguish. But when we looked at the DNA evidence, when you looked at the amino acids or the electrophoresis, it was very clear, right? You knew instantly after looking at some of that evidence which of those species was most closely related. And we can do that comparing enzymes, comparing proteins, comparing DNA, and so forth. And when we compare, for example, this is looking at hemoglobin in different animals and seeing how they compare. Human hemoglobin, there's only one difference between a gorilla and a human. Between a human and a frog, there's 67 differences. And so what that tells us is humans are more closely related to gorillas than they are frogs.